handing it over to you, Jenna.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here today with us, especially at this later time than usual for this month. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Karl Pillemer. He is a professor of human development at Cornell University and a professor of gerontology in medicine at Weill Cornell Medicine. His career has been devoted to using research to improve the care and quality of older adults. And over the past decade, he's led a program of research on the relationship between aging and environmental sustainability. His current project examines environmental civic engagement and volunteerism among older people, including developing and evaluating new methods to train and recruit retirees for environmental leadership and action. His other projects focus on the heightened vulnerability of older people to the effects of climate change, as well as the clinical and policy options to address it. He also created the Cornell Initiative for Climate Research and Aging, which serves as a hub for this topic. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Karl Pillemer, who is joining us today all the way from New Zealand on his vacation. So many, many thanks to you. We're thrilled to have you.
Great. And let me say, first of all, I know that this project, I think, maybe originally involved out of some Kendall communities, and I've had almost a career-long engagement with Kendall in many different ways, including working with the Kendall Corporation on some quality of life and care issues. I was also, on the board of Kendall at Ithaca, so I'm curious as to whether we have some Kendall at Ithaca folks. And I was raised in the town of Oberlin, so I have, childhood friends who are now Kendall at Oberlin residents. So
Wow.
to see all of you here. Jenna, the one thing I would remind, just because I always forget, is maybe if looks like everybody's been good, but if folks can mute, of themselves, because I often forget, and then there's background noise. So I'm going to put on my PowerPoint in a moment, and I presume I have the sharing ability, but I wanted to say I'm so pleased to be able to join you. And maybe unlike some other speakers that you may have had, our institute at Cornell, which I'll talk about and give you some background on, is very, very interested in collaborating with a group like SAFE. And that we have collaborations with some other similar organizations. There may be some of you who are members of Elders Climate Action, and we have been very involved with them. And a lot of what we do is applied research, evaluation, intervention projects. But most of the work I've done throughout my career and that our institute does is working with organizations like yours. So almost all of our research is not, sort of ivory tower research, but is active research in partnership with community organizations or national organizations. I also want to introduce, and you'll see her later on, Chloe Shores, who, if we do have additional contact, is the associate director of our institute and also a good contact person. So I hope that I'm going to tell you a little bit more than might be usual about our program and what we're doing, because we'd really like to pursue some possibilities for collaboration. In terms of grants, we are frequently writing grants and then often doing those in partnership with organizations. So I want to talk, perhaps more generally than this title indicates, about the overall connection between aging and in particular climate change, because that's our focus. However, if I say climate change, I want you to know that we're also implying we also look at wider sustainability efforts, but some of our focus is on the intersection of these two massive trends in the US, but also the world, which is the exponential growth in the older population and the threat of climate change, and the importance of connecting research, programming, planning about aging with climate change. And it's interesting, I will say, like you may hear me say this, I am still used to, I began as a gerontologist some 40 years ago when older people were they. Now it's 71, older people are we. But if I say they when I refer to older people, you'll know that I mean us. So in part, this presentation really is about you. That is, it's a big chunk of it. I'm going to talk about some other things first, but a lot of the work that we're doing has to do with understanding activism and environmental engagement and climate change action among older people. And I'll be able to tell you sort of why that is. And one thing I mentioned this earlier, but I want to say, so with those of us who are involved in geriatrics and gerontology, in the study of aging, and in developing programs, one of the strongest points that my colleagues and I make is that the field of aging must address climate change, and the field of climate change must address aging. And to say about myself, just to give a little context, much of my earlier work in gerontology had to do in two things. One was in the social integration of older people. So how can older people, especially after retirement, stay engaged in meaningful roles, meaningful relationships, and responsibilities? But also a lot of our work has been on how do we protect very vulnerable older people in a bunch of contexts. Like a growing number of people in the field of aging, many of us have moved our interests into the area of climate change because it is indeed, the major threat to longevity in our time. So really, climate change, it's the elephant in the room that can't be ignored, and I'll say why that is. One reason that I only want to spend maybe 3 or 4 minutes on, but I think it's important to make the point that older people are likely the most vulnerable population currently to the effects of climate change. So even though, and I'll come back to this later, even though most of our thinking, most activist thinking, and most public discourse is about climate change's impact on future generations, for older adults, that future is now. And I think that's an important point to make. And as I say, I won't spend too much time on it, but I think it's a very important part of the context. And so what we believe in our center and in the larger group of social scientists who are working on this, gerontologists and also medical geriatricians, is that we have to move from here to here or even closer, because right now, aging and climate change aren't being connected. People aren't really thinking about them together. And there are two main reasons why we need to. One reason why we need to collect aging and climate change is that older people are currently throughout the world at great risk, and maybe the greatest risk right now, of climate change effects. And more important, and I'm going to spend more time on it, older activists are a key solution to the issue. So I do want to touch on this. I don't want to depress us, but I do think it's important to talk about this because it has to do with how we can get older people who are less interested, perhaps, not who are denying climate change, but who at least may have some interest, but aren't inclined to act yet. It seems to me that this is one important part of the messaging. So as I said, we're concerned, we older people are concerned for future generations, but we also need to be concerned for ourselves. And I'm going to touch on this too, because even when I talk to older activists, this isn't something that they're keenly aware of. So one of the things about us as older people is we are much more vulnerable to environmental threats. So our bodies can't compensate for the effects of environmental hazards as well, though we don't clear chemicals as well. Though with those of us who are taking various kinds of pharmaceuticals, who have chronic conditions, our immune systems are more suppressed. So one of the major things, the major risks to the older population are heat events. Our bodies are less efficient at regulating temperature. We often aren't aware that we're getting overheated as much as younger people are. And a number of studies show that when there are extreme heat events, rates of illness go up, hospitalizations and death increase dramatically for older adults. As you've probably read, and I'll come back to, disasters have an immensely disproportionate effect on older people, especially people with functional disabilities or dementia. Evacuation and displacement is hugely problematic. And there's certainly effect on both formal and informal caregivers. So I want to touch on the result. And again, because even if you've been involved in this field, you might not be thinking of it. So for example, in Hurricane Katrina, people aged 75 and older made up 6% of the population and accounted for half of the deaths in Hurricane Katrina. In the 2018 wildfire, nearly all of the fatalities were people aged 60 and over. Hurricane Sandy, those of us on the East Coast, because we were around then, again, half the deaths were people aged 65 and older. So when there was a cold snap, unaccustomed in Texas, people over 60 were 60% of the deaths. In the recent heat wave, older people were especially vulnerable, and more than half of the people who died in that were age 75 and older. Now, why do I highlight that as part of this presentation? Well, as I noted, if our interest is, and I'll come back to arguing that this is our interest, that we need massive involvement of older people, beyond people like us. Well, most climate change narratives focus on, for example, loving your mother, biophilia, love of the earth, or the perils for future generations. But as I said, for older people, that future is now because our risk is so much greater. So some older people, it turns out from the limited research, can't be motivated to action by their own self-interest. And I'll come back to the fact that we find that older people across the political spectrum are very concerned about this. So, and our research shows that many older people are concerned for their own safety, but don't know what kind of action they could take. They don't see a pathway. And that's, I think, of what we can provide them. So the problem, though, with this prior research I've just shown you is there's lots of research in public health epidemiology focusing on older people like us as victims. So that's what a lot of the research has been. And our argument in our work is that we have to move beyond us to research and studies that policies that don't just focus on older people at risk, but on older people's critical role in addressing environmental problems. And so really what our view is that we need more knowledge and programs that promote engagement like yours. The idea is that older people are being treated a bit in policy and research dialogues as passive victims. And, to borrow a phrase from other movements, nothing about us without us. The need to mobilize older people is critical. And so there is this need for full participation. So what we know now, so why is it so ideal for older people to embrace environmental and climate change action? Well, many older people have a number of advantages that some younger people don't. One is after retirement, there's more discretionary time, and that's something we hear from a lot of people in our studies. But also older people have a vast reservoir of experience, and depending on how they've worked, they may have more economic, certainly time resources. But there's one thing we can't forget, and it's an underpinning of our work, is with the aging of the baby boom, the oldest boomers are now hitting 80. The ones like me who are right in the middle are in their 70s. The possibility for collective impact, if our generation mobilizes, is really dramatic. And finally, and a point I'll come back to, is research is really showing that of all the kinds of activities people can do after retirement, environmental volunteerism and climate change action is uniquely appropriate for what developmental psychology shows us are the developmental tasks of later life. And for those of you who've had psychology, you're familiar with the concept of generativity. And that has been shown again and again to be characteristic as people enter their late 60s and early 70s, perhaps even earlier. They become aware of a limited time horizon, but in a different way from younger people. Namely, you've heard many 30-year-olds have a near-death experience or an accident and say, now I'm going to stop and smell the roses, and they really don't. They simply go back to their previous life. Older people have the benefit of a keen awareness of a limited time horizon, and that doesn't so much make people depressed as it has some positive effects. And one of those is a desire to contribute to a future that we ourselves may not live to see. Tapping, we find in our studies again and again that this is such a powerful motivation from just interest in environmental issues to actual action that we see it as a major recruitment resource. I do want to add too that in terms of our own self-interest, it's not just that older people are more at risk, but there have been a number of studies, including ones we did, that across the range of volunteerism. So older people volunteer in massive numbers, as you're aware. But actually, there seems to be a special benefit for environmental volunteering. And so we did a study of outcomes over 20 years showing that environmental volunteers are more likely to stay physically active. It strongly promoted both physical activity levels and health. So people who, in the range of volunteering activities, chose the one many of you are doing, experienced health and well-being benefits. And I don't need to go into the benefits to communities much, but our studies and those of others have shown that when older people become involved, they can help other people change their daily habits and practices. Clearly, like a lot of you are doing in your communities, you're improving local environments. In our studies of older climate activists, we find people who are strongly involved in changing policy. I presume some of you are familiar with what occurred in Switzerland with a group called the Klimasenioren in Schweiz, where they actually were able to create major policy impact by their organized activity. And we're collecting, and maybe some of you might participate, how older people manage to remain hopeful and how they can provide environmental wisdom to younger people. So our response has been to create, with some external funding, something called the Cornell Initiative for Research on Climate and Aging. And you don't need to write down the URL. If you just type in CIRCA, Cornell, for example, you will get there. We're doing research on other issues with a number of people across Cornell and other institutions, but a major focus is understanding and promoting environmental activism among older people. So you can see our enthusiasm about maybe working with you folks later. One project has been in-depth interviews of older climate change activists. These are very detailed, in-depth, qualitative interviews. We are likely to be reopening this project for more interviews. So one thing we're going to talk with Jen and others about is whether some SAFE members might be interested in participating. We have just completed a national survey of the group Elders Climate Action, which provides a fascinating opportunity to look at, for example, why some people become more involved and others do not. So that is going to provide a national profile. And again, we've talked with SAFE about maybe doing this survey with you folks. And we've been conducting a focus group study across New York State, both in New York City and in rural New York. Those of you who may not be as familiar with New York may not realize that parts of New York, certain counties in New York, are very rural and very red, so to speak. So they are areas that have people consider less traditionally friendly to a focus on climate change. And we have been able to look at what they're thinking about, both in urban areas. And these are also people who are much more diverse often than folks in the climate change movement in terms of race, ethnic, and geographic diversity. So I say this because these are the kind of things we do, that we're trying to understand this connection between the older population and climate change. And as I say, we're looking for collaborators. So the kind of things we feel that's important to learn are what promotes older environmental activism. So what if you have, we're learning in our studies, even in very rural and very conservative counties, there are very few true climate change deniers in the older population. There is certainly a lot of difference of opinion about what's causing it, whether it's a natural process and whether there's anything we can do. But so the question is, how do we move people to activism? So we're looking at motivations. I'll touch on that. What changes people who might have some general interest into action? But we also have learned in our studies that there is a paradox about especially climate change action, namely, one way to relieve climate anxiety, a number of studies show, is to become involved. But as individuals learn more about climate change, they can develop stress and burnout and discouragement. So how do we understand that, and how do we deal with it? And also, once people get involved, why do they stay involved, or why do they stop? We're also interested in kind of more generally, is what are older people thinking about climate change? What kinds of preparation are they taking? In terms of that middle bullet, we have learned that across the spectrum, class, race, rural location, people are very concerned about the changing weather and about extreme weather events. And it seems independent almost of their political orientation. So I think that's a major hook too that we can be using. I'm just keeping an eye on the time. We stop in about maybe 10 minutes or so. And we're also interested in, because we've done projects like this on other topics, what advice do older climate and environmental activists have for younger people? How can younger people deal with their feelings of hopelessness and despair? And the overarching goal is, the only way, in our view, that any progress is going to be made is massive citizen engagement around climate change. So how do we move the needle? How do we get more people like you involved in this? So one thing I'd like to touch on, and I'm going to do this there are probably a number. I love talking to people my own age, because the cultural references. So you may remember the movie If It's Tuesday, It Must Be Belgium, where people are, going on a European trip and stopping in every country. Well, I'm going to be brief on these. And then if we want to come back to it, either to any of these issues later or in a later meeting, that's fine. So one thing I wanted to share with you, one thing that we've been focusing on in all of these studies is what does lead older people to devote, their time. I think of myself, so I have age 71 to eternity. Why am I choosing, or why is someone like me choosing to devote my limited lifetime to something that may not benefit me personally, but is more oriented towards future generations? So we're studying this. And I want to just offer you briefly the 5 pathways our research has uncovered. I am very curious if you fit into one of these pathways. So one is lifelong awareness of environmental change, leading to a sense of urgency. So one thing which motivates older people is this increasing awareness of how urgent this problem is and how little time there is. But over the course, and sorry for the typo, there is actually no words snenvironmental, but no, it's a new term we've created, sorry. It could be senior environmental, snenvironmental. But also many of the activists we've talked to are aware of changes in a particular location. So for example, we talked to older people in rural counties who have a lifelong legacy of hunting and fishing, who are disturbed by changes in the local environment. And this awareness leads to a desire to spread the word as people become more aware. I've already mentioned generativity, but both There are two types of generativity. The vast majority of older environmental activists in our studies mention their own children, and in particular grandchildren. So there's family generativity, but also more general human and planetary survival. On a personal level, people find very meaningful social connections and the opportunity for lifelong learning. So many people said, I've just learned a lot more, especially people who were not involved in environmental activities before. But one interesting thing with social connection that we found in our studies is that many older activists find not just an increase in the quantity of social connections, but in the quality. So people find that as part of their activities, they develop very high quality relationships with other people. And I think that's also a way we can market this kind of activity. There are people who find this as a way, moral obligation. This is something I am morally obliged to do to help protect the planet. And a number of people express either a pathway through religious or spiritual beliefs. And this really is something we've tried to convey to young people, that deeply religious people don't automatically fall into a climate change a denier category, that many older climate activists are inspired by their own religious traditions. And finally, this sense of dealing with emotions or emotional regulation. So some people have been motivated by their emotional connectedness through nature. But one thing that we do know, and I highlight this middle bullet, is for all age groups, what psychologists have found is that getting engaged is a major way that people can relieve their climate dread, their climate discouragement, and climate anxiety. And many of our research participants said this, and it's a pathway to purpose and meaning. But the last thing I want to touch on is, why aren't more people involved? And we have been trying to look at this, and you may have ideas. So, for example, in your own communities, you have presumably tried to engage people who were sort of vaguely interested but didn't join in, and you've probably wondered, well, what is it? So what can we do to facilitate engagement? So one thing is a lack of concern. So there are some data showing that even though older people volunteer in enormous numbers, only around 1% choose environmental volunteering as their major activity. So we have a vast reservoir. I want to blame ourselves too. I just want to share, we created a special interest group on climate change in our big professional organization. And out of the 5,000 members, about maybe 40 or 50 initially agreed to be part of it. So it's, it's not, this connection between older people, environmental work is not entirely clear. There also still, now this is changing, but many surveys show that compared to younger people in general, older adults have a lower level of what we would call pro-environmental attitude. So you've seen these surveys. They ask, would you be willing to sacrifice part of your income on behalf of the environment? Or would you support divestment from fossil fuels? A significant proportion of older people do endorse these factors, but they tend to do so less than younger people. Now that is changing and it's becoming more equal. Still, though, it represents a barrier to some degree. We also found in our studies that the reason why groups like SAFE are so critically important is that many older, or at least some people, experience a barrier to engagement. We did a survey of local environmental organizations and found that many were unready for older volunteers. They weren't, for people who can't go out and do a stream cleanup or a trail maintenance, or they were not adapting activities according to people's changing physical ability. They weren't really recruiting older people. And among older people themselves, we have found that the reason for the 1% of involvement is some older people feel that they don't understand it, that they don't know the basics or what they would get involved in, or even not some of the scientific issues. So that's something else we found. I won't go into this in great detail. There certainly is ageism in the climate change movement. If everybody knows, the singer Billie Eilish, this is a typical quote. Hopefully the old people start listening to us, young people, about climate change so that we don't all die. Old people are going to die and don't really care if we die. So there is some ageism in the climate change movement. There's blaming our generation. So that's something people just have to be aware of. So I'll close by saying, and maybe you'll have thoughts that, how we need to think about how can we innovate to expand older people's participation? Because on the positive side, there are just so many people who could be involved who aren't. But one thing that we found, and we've developed a program to do this, and we don't have time to talk about today, but could later, is a kind of short-term training for people who've never been involved in this in terms of what the basic issues are. Some fundamental environmental literacy really helps people get involved. I mentioned the adaptation of different types of ability, reaching out to established environmental organizations and showing them how they can involve older people. And I'll go to the last one. Even though the digital divide is decreasing with older people, there are still some folks, especially in the 75 and above range, who would prefer more in-person contact or other issues. So the moving to almost exclusively virtual information sharing can be a barrier for some people. And finally, one of the things that people want, as you might know from personal experience, after retirement is the ability to replace workplace relationships. Historically, a lot of environmental activities we found in our studies are more individual. Again, stream cleanups, trail cleanups, other kinds of issues. And so building in a social component where people are working together is really positive. I won't go into this because I'd like to leave time for questions, but we have developed an intervention program that's easily available. You can see it on our website called Retirees in Service to the Environment that has been used in assisted living and in independent living for older people as well. So that's a broad notion of community-based where we attempt to overcome these barriers. And it's basically there is educational content about the environment, volunteer leadership training. So how can I get the kind of volunteer work I would like? And then there's a group capstone project. I have a sense in SAFE that people who are involved are very, very savvy about this. But if there's a desire to run this program with people who might be sort of, curious or might want to be engaged, we have found this to be a really effective program. And I will just, hold on, excuse me. Oh, I'm going up instead of down. Sorry about that. From a study of 149 participants in 11 sites in New York and Florida, though we found, and it was a randomized controlled design, we found that for older people, their feelings of generativity increased, they experienced greater social integration, increased their environmental knowledge and community leadership skills. And the strongest benefits, as you might expect, were people who hadn't done any work in the environment before. They were retiring or moving to a new situation and had a desire to be involved. And it involved in hundreds and hundreds of extra hours. So that's something that we could talk about later. So for all these things, I do think communities like yours are a tremendous place to be doing this kind of work. The one thing I haven't talked about, because I'm sure it's not even remotely necessary for this group, is the impact of senior living in general and the communities like you are living in and like I've been involved in. Their environmental impact is obviously great, especially as they're growing and as many are built in environmentally sensitive areas. So, I think this whole idea of how we can involve and understand how to get older people more involved, a great place to start is in communities like you're involved in. So, we don't have time for this now, but as I say, our center, our institute, is eager to partner in either studies we do or projects that you might be interested in. And since it cuts across, not in this institute, but in our larger aging and environment group at Cornell, there's a lot of interest in independent living, assisted living, and communities for older people. So it seems like a very nice fit. And I'm going to stop